Hello everyone, and welcome back to Dragalia Foundry, a fan channel where everything Dragalia Lost can be found. This video is going to contain my review of the upcoming Summon Showcase. It's another Gala remix, this time around featuring Gala Ranzal, as well as a new limited time adventurer, Valentine's Chelsea. Valentine's Chelsea is a wind bow, and alongside her we also have a new permanent pool wind dragon, Menoetius, who's a sibling to Prometheus and Epimetheus, two dragons that we've gotten on Valentine's Days past. So this showcase is a Gala remix, which means it brings back a Gala adventurer or dragon at an appearance rate up. In this case, it's Ranzal. It also means that it has 6% base appearance rates for 5 stars, and sometimes it'll include other Gala dragons and adventurers, but if they're included, they're usually not included at an appearance rate up. They're just available on the showcase with no guarantee that you'll actually summon them. In this case, with this showcase happening around Valentine's Day, it also brings back 2 other limited adventurers, Valentine's Melody and Addis, but not with an appearance rate up, not actually featured on the showcase. So once again, if you get these characters, it's totally random, it's pure luck. In this case, because they're limited, I expect that they'll be eligible for Worm Sigil Redemption, meaning if you really want to spark for them, you can. But outside of that, I think they're here to incentivize people to summon, to potentially spark, but your probability of actually getting them is going to be fairly low. Now, as for whether or not you should summon on this showcase, well, I think if you've seen my Panther summoning video, you'll know the answer from my point of view. I definitely don't have the resources to just throw around and summon on this showcase after going all out for Panther, and it was really fun reading through your comments, by the way. Thank you for your concern. Don't worry, I'm doing fine. I just thought it was funnier and more interesting to present my summoning video in that way, so that's why I went for that format. But even if you're not in my position and you had a stash saved up, I still wouldn't recommend you summon on this showcase. I know a lot of you out there will be in a similar situation because we've come off of 2 months of limited banners. We just had a 2-part collaboration banner with some really lucrative characters. So I think that a lot of you won't have resources, but even if you did, here's my reasoning for why you shouldn't summon on this showcase. Basically, my argument boils down to this. Water element content is not hard enough to justify trying to summon and spend a lot of resources on powerful wind adventurers. So this is the same argument I tried to make for Kimono Luca. I just don't think Kimono Luca and similarly Valentine's Chelsea make enough of a difference for current water endgame content that you must have them or really want to have them available to you on your teams. In the future, when Legend difficulty water content releases, which may be as soon as next month or early the following month, then yes, those adventurers for co-op specifically may have some applications there. They may be very good. But I think that as of now, with Master difficulty and below for water content in the Agito Uprising, you just don't need characters of this caliber. And a lot of the core setups are already very good at autoing consistently, soloing consistently. So the core setups for Ciela right now usually include Templar Hope as your lead. He's a 4-star adventurer, Ranzal, who is a 4-star welfare adventurer, and Lowen as a healer, who's a 4-star adventurer once again. You really only have one slot that you need to actually fill with a more powerful unit or a unit who helps you survive, and that slot is actually fairly flexible. You can throw in Luis, you can throw in Mine, you can throw in Silas. So there's actually a good amount of variation you can do with that last slot, as long as you have a good mix of survival and damage. So essentially, water content is kind of solved right now. There's no need to power up your water teams, or your wind teams rather, further to beat water bosses. Water bosses can already be easily autoed, soloed, and you probably have the pieces in your collection to do it already, because some of these setups, for Master, they run 1 to 3 gold Fafnirs. For Expert, they run 1 to 4 gold Fafnirs with varying degrees of reliability. So essentially, I don't think there's any reason to pull for these powerful wind adventurers at the time of recording. In the future, maybe for Legend, these will be good. When you compare this to Mona, who we just had, I think that Mona was a really reliable summon for Legend difficulty because it's a wind boost co-ability. That's going to go on any wind DPS character that you bring to co-op as a backliner. In this case, I don't think that the co-ability is there, so essentially for Chelsea, it's a character that you only want to bring her if you're playing as her, and same with Ranzal. I don't think his co-ability is particularly amazing or anything, so these characters right now look like they'd be great in Master difficulty of Ciela for co-op play, and that makes me think they'll probably be great in Legend difficulty too. But the problem is Ciela is so much better and easier to do in solo compared to co-op that I can never recommend a win character for how good they are on their merits in co-op play, because there's no water boss that you're going to be doing a lot of co-op against, I think. So that's my take and my reason on the showcase. It's just overkill for the wind element. You don't need to have these hot new characters to beat up on Ciela. She's already dead. The content is already defeated, essentially. Now, where I do think there are some interesting applications here, I'll point those out. So one, Valentine's Chelsea has a really unique gimmick around affliction resistance that could give her some play in More Sayadi Reckoning, still a fairly fresh endgame content, so I want to point that out and acknowledge that might be an interesting use for her. And also Valentine's Melody, she's not featured here, but I do want to point her out. She's one of only 2 adventurers with the critical damage co-ability right now. That co-ability is relevant on DPS who rely upon critical hits, including Lin Yu, and I think that because of Legend, the way that works, your backliners, your co-ability bots, they have to match elements with your lead adventurer when it comes to co-op play. So if you want to run a character like Lin Yu in co-op, having Halloween Mim, the other source of the critical damage co-ability, is not going to work for Legend Ciela because that character, Halloween Mim, is flame element, so you can't use her as a backliner against Legend Ciela. In that case, you'd need Valentine's Melody. So these are the actually only 2 meta implications I really see on this showcase, outside of speculating on what Legend Ciela will look like. As for the adventure breakdown, let's start with Chelsea here. I do love her portrait. I mean, look at this on the left. Look at her face, the mouth, the Luca pupils. So I think that they really did her justice, her character here with the Valentine's rendition. I do love her portrait. I love that Luca spooked over to the side. To kind of summarize what her kit does, because it's very, very long. Basically, the way her kit works is it revolves around a romance gauge that can build up to 5 charges. And when you have no or 1 charge, you're kind of reduced in power. You're actually debuffed. As soon as you get 2 charges, you're sort of neutral, and then 3 to 5, then Chelsea is sort of coming out ahead here. In addition, her affliction res doesn't work like normal, so she actually is, I think, the only adventurer, or one of very few, that don't have a proper affliction resistance in her second slot. I know Gala Mim's kind of similar because her affliction res is split across 2 abilities. And then she has Stormlash Punisher. This is the simplest thing in her kit, just increases her damage. But essentially, she burns herself and afflicts herself in that way. And then anytime she's affected or hit by a move that could cause an affliction, it slowly powers her up, and eventually she becomes immune to afflictions. And when her romance gauge is fully charged, she also just does a lot more damage. As for her skills, Rampaging Passion, this is her first one. This burns you, but it gives you a strength buff that lasts for a short duration, and it deals damage and inflicts Stormlash. The damage on this is very solid, almost a 3000% mod, only requiring 2910 for SP or skill energy, which you can get very fast as a bow, especially because skill haste is built in there. It burns you, so that's the drawback, but that actually plays into her kit, so it's not as much of a drawback as it may seem. And then the obstruction deleter is just a small strength buff. Stormlash, nice to have, obviously, with her having Stormlash Punisher. Her second skill, Infinite Love, gives her 1 full charge on her romance gauge and activates Skill Shift. This has 3 total phases. When your romance gauge is fully charged, this gives all teammates the Sweet Valentine effect and gives her the Bittersweet Valentine effect, and immediately readies her first skill for use, and there's no longer a Skill Shift component. So when you're charging up your gauge, the first time you use this, it's just gonna fill 1 gauge of your Valentine's gauge, so 1 charge. The second time, in phase 2, you get this entire team Sweet Valentine defensive buff, and you get 1 charge to the Valentine's gauge. And then in phase 3, you get another charge to the Valentine's gauge, you get the defensive buff for the team, and you get the user buff of Bittersweet Valentine. So phase 3 is similar to how this will work going forward once your Valentine's Day is, your romance gauge is fully charged. So basically, once it's fully charged, you're going to get a team defensive buff, a user skill damage buff, and you're going to immediately ready your Rampaging Passion for an additional use. So this is pretty good. I think that this is pretty strong in a raid context like Merciati Reckoning, because although this has a high SP cost, with the prevalence of Gauna and Krenna and skill recharge as a whole, this is a way to turbocharge your romance gauge in that co-op environment. As for her co-ability and chain co-ability, it's Skill Haste, standard for bows, and then Vengeful Shield. So Vengeful Shield grants the user a one-use shield that nullifies damage up to 25% of her maximum HP when she's hit by an attack that inflicts an affliction. So she doesn't have to get afflicted, she just has to be hit by an attack that would cause an affliction. After activating, this ability doesn't activate again for 20 seconds. The shield doesn't stack, and this benefits your whole team. So on her personally, this is going to give her a shield whenever she uses her first skill, because it causes burn to herself. And then for your team, if you're running her in, say, an auto comp, and I do think she could probably slot in reasonably well to that Templar Hope, Ranzal, Low, and Core. So if any of them ever got afflicted, which won't happen for Templar Hope, but it could happen for the other adventurers, well, they'd immediately get a shield to kind of help protect them from whatever next attack that could hit them. So I do think that's kind of a little novel effect. Those small shields don't seem like much, but they may be beneficial in a solo setting with how Legend looks. Maybe it'll be beneficial as well. 25% is a decent chunk, especially when you think about, well, I guess this might not matter, but like max HP buffs and stuff, and all the defensive buffs that are happening. So with all the defensive buffs happening in Templar Hope settings, your defense is higher, so attacks do less damage to you. They're less likely to exceed this 25% shield. Okay, so for the abilities, let's kind of read through what it says here with the bulleted list, because this summarizes how her Mad Romantic ability works. This is the one that gives her the romance gauge. It can have up to 5 charges. It powers up her standard attacks and her first skill when the romance gauge has 5 charges. We've seen that. Grants the romance gauge 1 full charge when the infinite love skill is used. That's her second skill, we know that. Fills the romance gauge by 12.5% when the user is buffed with a skill. After activating, this effect will not activate again for 5 seconds. Alright, so this would fill her gauge every time she uses her first skill by 12.5%. I assume this would also fill her gauge if you're in the skill shift portion of her second skill. This would also fill her gauge because she gives herself a skill damage buff as well. But I'm not sure if her team defense buff will also fill this. I guess it would, but this would probably count as one buff because it's within 5 seconds. It happens simultaneously. So I think when you use your second skill, you get 1 full gauge as well as 12.5% additional, assuming you hadn't been buffed recently by another skill. And then finally, grants the following effects based on the number of charges the romance gauge has. So this is sort of what I said earlier. When you have no charges or 1, you're at a disadvantage. 2 is sort of neutral but not great. And then 3 onward, you're starting to accumulate an advantage to her. So with no charges, your skill damage, defense, and max HP are all reduced by 10%. Once you get your first romance gauge charge, you get reduced skill damage, defense, and maximum HP by 5% instead of 10%. And you get affliction res of 20%. With 2, you get affliction res of 40%, and you have no drawback on your skill damage, defense, or HP. With 3, you get an increase to your skill damage, defense, and max HP of 5%, so those are actually going up now. Affliction res of 60%. With 4, all those things go up by 10%, and affliction res of 80%. And with 5, skill damage is up by 25%, defense and max HP are up by 15%, and you're totally immune, or your susceptibility is totally reduced to afflictions 100%. So essentially, as soon as you can ramp her up to 5, she becomes really strong, but even starting at 3, she's getting little benefits, with the drawback being she doesn't have a true affliction res built in until she gets to 5, and then she's totally resistant to afflictions. But even having 60 or 80% res there is going to mean some amount of the time, hopefully you avoid burning yourself. So I still like that the way that she's built kind of ramps her up. I think it's really cool. And her second skill, when the user is inflicted by an attack that inflicts burn specifically, the skill gauge for Infinite Love is filled by 25%. So that's pretty cool. So that's another way to get your charges on your romance gauge faster, because Infinite Love is her second skill. So essentially every time you use your first skill, because that's an attack that inflicts burn, whether or not you resist the burn is irrelevant, but every time you use that attack, you fill up your second skill a quarter of the way, and you get this Heart's Blaze effect for 8 seconds. During Heart's Blaze, the user's attack rate is increased by 15%, also really nice, a lot faster attacking, and their next 3 Force Strikes are granted an ability to dispel one enemy buff. Heart's Blaze will not stack, and after activating it won't activate again for 5 seconds. So she even has this spell built in, which against Ciela does matter because she ramps up a lot of defensive buffs, and that's one of the reasons why Lowen and Ranzal are kind of nice against her in auto setups, or Grace if you have a Grace, also pretty good against her. Yeah, I do think Valentine's Chelsea is a fantastic adventure. I would love to try her out in an auto setup or solo setup, and I think she's strong for co-op. She has good damage modifiers, really interesting setup. Unless she dies off when she only has 1 or 2 charges on her romance gauge, she has the potential to really snowball. Unfortunately, I just think it's overkill. I think it's just more than what's needed right now. When Legend Ciela comes out, or if you're a time attack person and you love going for epithets, like maybe at that point, but even in a time attack scenario, she has to ramp up, so I don't see her being that good for time attack either. As far as her design, though, I absolutely love it. The romance gauge is hilarious. The fact that she burns herself is also super funny and charming. I've often wanted like a burning prep Wyrmprint in Dragalia Lost to function similarly to like a flame orb or something like that. Like you give that Wyrmprint to a character and they start off the battle just on fire. I've wanted that for Veronica and other low HP characters. So I love that we finally have a character like this that just afflicts herself and it represents her burning passion. I think it's a really cool design. I really like her as an adventurer, but it's just hard to recommend. So moving on from Valentine's Chelsea, let's talk about Menoetius here. So Menoetius is a wind element dragon, and he inflicts Stormlash with his skill. His abilities are Strength and Water Res 5 if the user is attuned to wind, increases strength by 50% and adds 15% to water res. This is similar to the ability seen on Prometheus. Prometheus is a flame dragon who grants wind res, and Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh is a light dragon who grants shadow res. But then, to just straight up power creep those two, Menoetius also has Vengeful Strength and Counter 2. Maybe we'll see a retcon or a revision to those other 2 dragons to boost their power and give them something similar to this starting tomorrow. I hope we see that, because it feels a little odd that they're not in a proper cycle and Menoetius is actually just better, having an additional effect. But what this does is if the user is attuned to wind, deals wind damage to surrounding enemies, and grants the user the Deranged Thrill effect for 45 seconds when they're hit by an attack that inflicts an affliction. So again, you just have to be hit by the attack that would cause an affliction. You don't have to actually get afflicted. So if you resist it, you still get the benefit. And during Deranged Thrill, the user's strength is increased by 25%. After activating, it won't activate again for 20 seconds, and it doesn't stack. So this is I assume a visible strength buff. Like this will appear as an icon at the bottom of the screen. So it's a different bracket than the 50% strength. So I don't think it's proper to think about this as like a 75% strength dragon. Because you're going to have a lot of visible strength buffs. So you do get diminishing returns on those when you're running characters like Templar Hope and double buff setups, which are common in the wind element. But still, this is a very defensive dragon. So there's some potential merit to that. I just don't see any scenario where I would justify spending Sunlight Stones on this. If you get this, have it in your collection, cool. But wind is really stacked as far as its dragons. You have dragons who are available in the essences like Freya that are really strong. Even Garuda has a niche, even though she's not recommended on most characters, but she does have a slight niche for autoing. And as far as gacha dragons, there are dragons like Midgard Stormer 0 that it's nice to have one of on a team because of the wind resistance that it applies to the boss, as well as Gala Reborn Zephyr, just an all-around really strong dragon for DPS characters. Even Ariel and Vayu still see a little bit of use, and if that's what you have, they're pretty good. So Menoetius, unless you really need survival, I don't see it being really a thing. I could see this, like, if you want to auto Legend Ciela for fun one day, like maybe you want Menoetius because of the water res, but otherwise I think it's just more than what you need to auto Master Ciela and below. And the thing about optimizing for Legend and why I don't necessarily think pulling for Legend even makes sense, Legend is a fight that you have to do once a week for weekly bonuses. It's not like Legend is something you farm, right? You don't want to really get low clear times on Legend. Does that really matter all that much? For some people it does, and that's exciting, and that's the fun thing they enjoy in Dragalia, so I do respect that, but I think, like, if you're looking at this from a content completion standpoint, you know, why are you trying to optimize around Legend compared to some of the content that you actually have to play a lot more of to farm up weapons, to get weapon bonuses, to get your facility levels up? Legend is something that you can kind of easily do once a week with a suboptimal team, and if you really wanted to grind it out, then yes, you can sort of optimize and build around it, but I've never seen it as like a main reason to summon. So far, they haven't been hard enough that they precluded any player from using the existing adventures they had, I think. Like, if you've been playing for a while, that is, and you have a powerful team and powerful setup. If you're newer to the game, then maybe, you know, maybe if Valentine's Chelsea is like your really one strong win adventure, that's something to consider. But I don't even know if I would build Valentine's Chelsea before building like Templar Hope, for example. Alright, and finally we have Gala Ranzal. So Gala Ranzal got a lot better in version 2.0 of Dragalia Lost. Prior to that, he was kind of a bad adventurer. He does have critical rate double buff as his chain co ability, but this has a cooldown. So it buffs you for 15 seconds and then it doesn't activate again for 15 seconds. So this doesn't work in the same explosive way that Feline Hospitality, the critical damage double buff Wormprint, does because of that cooldown. That really nerfs this. Dragon's Haste is the standard co-ability on swords. And Gala Ranzal is a character focused on 2 gauges. So Experience Boon 2 gives him an attack gauge and a burst gauge. Attack gauge fills when regular attacks connect with enemies. Burst gauge fills when 4 strikes successfully connect. For every completely filled gauge, his defenses are increased, and any filled gauges are consumed when using the Cyclone Blade skill, increasing its power. Relentless Spear 2, he has both freeze and bog res, and then he has skill damage plus 30%. Cyclone Blade deals damage to the target and nearby enemies. It's okay. It's a fine amount of damage. It's the damage dealing skill. Wind Tactics activates Gale Clad Sword. The user's next 3 4 strikes are powered up and can damage far away enemies. Also increases the entire team's defense by 10% for 10 seconds. Also okay. Gala Ranzal is a character I find hard to evaluate because he is good in co-op. He's good with his 4 striking, his overdrive damage. Like, that could become a thing in Berserk of Legend of Ciela. So I do want to acknowledge that. But for solo, I don't know whether you really can include him or use him. Maybe if you craft multiple wind swords, you could include him alongside Templar Hope. I have heard a few things about, like, a few posts. I've read a few posts about Gala Ranzal's iframes and, like, his positioning being a little bit better in some scenarios than Templar Hope, but I think we're past that point. I think that was, like, for people who wanted to Gold Fafnir auto at an earlier stage of Dragalia Lost, so I don't really know if that's any relevant even anymore. But yeah, Gala Ranzal, just like okay, kind of straightforward. Don't really have much else to say on him. I think he's weaker than Valentine's Chelsea among the two, and she's also limited. So if I were summoning on this, I'd want to get her. But a little bit hard to judge Gala Ranzal. Alright, I think that's going to do it for today, everyone. I hope you've enjoyed this look at this summon showcase. It's definitely an interesting one, and I do love bows. I love Chelsea's design, so if I had the resources, I would probably consider summoning just because she's limited. But I think it's just more than we need right now. I think that water content is not at a place where you need to spend resources, precious summoning resources, trying to min-max on the water content. Let me know what you think about that in the comments below and your overall take on this banner. Thank you as always for watching, take care, and I'll see you next time.